What if the Soviet Union had invaded Western Europe? The snow came early to Berlin in January 1950. Flakes drifted like silent ashes across the broken skyline, over hollow churches, shattered concrete, and statues missing faces. To the west, children skated on frozen puddles in the rubble-strewn streets, their laughter thin and fleeting in the cold. But to the east, something darker stirred. Trains rumbled at midnight. Radios fell silent. And behind shuttered windows, citizens whispered of movements they did not understand. In Moscow, behind the thick walls of the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin leaned over a long wooden table as if it were a battlefield itself. The room was dim, heated only by tension. His generals, Malenkov, Beria, Zhukov, sat in silence as the general secretary traced a thick black line across a map of Europe. It ran westward from Warsaw to Paris. He called it Operation Vesna, Spring. The logic in Stalin's mind was both ironclad and irresistible. The United States was stretched thin, preoccupied with its newly escalating entanglement in Korea. Western Europe remained fragile and divided, its democracies scrambling to rebuild from the ruins of the Second World War. France was locked in domestic strife, Britain's empire unraveling by the day. West Germany, barely more than an administrative zone, had no real army. NATO, formed only months earlier, was a treaty in ink, not a force in the field. And most important of all, the Soviet Union now had the bomb. In August of the previous year, the Soviet RDS-1 nuclear device detonated over Semipalatinsk, stunning the world. The West had lost its monopoly, but Stalin believed he could win Europe without using it. Victory, he thought, would come not through annihilation, but through shock, speed, and relentless ideological pressure. He imagined Red Army tanks rolling through Frankfurt, columns of infantry hailed in Rome and Marseille as liberators from capitalist decay. He saw not a second Hitlerian blitzkrieg, but something colder, more methodical, an ideological flood rising westward. At 6:12 p.m. on January 16th, Stalin signed the order. No parade followed, no national broadcast was made, only silence. And trains filled with men, tanks, fuel, rations, and maps of places like Aachen, Strasbourg, and Lyon. In Berlin, East German officials received sealed envelopes. In Prague and Warsaw, armored divisions were put on alert. Soviet military advisors spoke in clipped tones behind closed doors. Civilians noticed the changes, but said nothing. After all, hadn't they survived one war already? But in Washington, D.C., far from the snows of Europe, a chill set in at the Pentagon. Analysts reviewing intercepted communications noticed spikes in Soviet rail traffic and sudden silence on multiple frequencies. The CIA, still young and understaffed, warned of unusual concentrations of troops in East Germany and Czechoslovakia. Yet without hard evidence, the warning went unheeded. Truman, still reeling from the chaos in Korea and facing a Republican Congress growing weary of global commitments, hesitated. Churchill, just returned to power in Britain after a political resurgence, sounded the alarm in private correspondence. The tide is not turning, but rising. And still, no one truly believed Stalin would move. Until he did. At precisely 4:45 a.m. on January 21st, the skies above the Fulda Gap turned red. Not from sunrise, but from fire. Soviet artillery opened with brutal coordination, a rolling barrage designed to confuse and overwhelm. Minutes later, the first wave of T-54 tanks surged westward, smashing through frontier defenses like glass. Paratroopers landed behind NATO lines in Hesse and Bavaria, targeting key infrastructure. Bridges were blown, communications severed. The Western world had 3 hours of peace left. By the time the sun rose over Europe, war had returned, not in theory, not in the minds of paranoid diplomats or Cold War novelists, but in steel, smoke, and blood. And this time, it had a red banner flying overhead. But one decision would change everything. The first official NATO transmission acknowledging war came at 6:03 a.m. It was brief, almost clinical. Hostilities commenced. Soviet forces breached Fulda Gap, mobilized per emergency protocol Iron Shield. The message bounced between bunkers in Bonn, Brussels, and London like a flare in the night. By then, it was already too late for preparedness. Only reaction remained. In West Germany, panic spread faster than Soviet tanks. Civilians awoke to the sound of artillery in the distance, the earth trembling beneath their homes. In Frankfurt, sirens screamed but offered no direction. Families scrambled for radios, only to hear static or emergency bulletins repeating, "Remain indoors, do not resist, await Allied assistance." But few had the luxury of waiting. By 10 a.m., Soviet spearheads had reached the outskirts of Frankfurt am Main. The city, still recovering from Allied bombings a few years prior, became a battleground once more. T-54s barreled down the A-66 Autobahn. Red Army infantry swept through the suburbs, encountering pockets of West German police and hastily armed reservists. The resistance was brave and meaningless. Most defenders were dead or captured by noon. Operation Vesna unfolded with terrifying efficiency. East German militias, long trained in secret by Soviet advisors, launched coordinated uprisings behind the lines. Railway hubs were seized, bridges sabotaged. West German infrastructure, still barely standing from wartime damage, crumbled under the weight of invasion. And NATO? The alliance had no standing army, only promises. American troops were still shipping to Korea. British forces were scattered from Malaya to Cyprus. France, inward-looking and politically paralyzed, had no plan for an invasion of its neighbor. NATO's supreme headquarters had only just begun operating from Paris. Their maps were unfinished, their war plans outdated. General Omar Bradley, summoned from Washington, stared grimly at the wall of red pins crawling across the European map. "They're not probing," he muttered. "They're swallowing." In London, Churchill took to Parliament. His voice, rough with age but thunderous with resolve, echoed beneath the arches of Westminster. "Let us make no mistake. This is not a raid. This is not a test. This is guerre. And if we do not rise to meet it, the lights of Europe will be extinguished once more, and this time, perhaps forever." But it was in the cities of Western Europe where the true cost began to show. In Bonn, the newly established West German government fled south. Luxembourg declared a state of emergency. In Brussels, Belgian officials debated evacuation as Soviet aircraft were spotted crossing the German border. In the French border town of Strasbourg, residents watched with dread as black smoke rose from the east. They remembered the last war. Many had buried their fathers beneath those same skies. Some now began burying their sons. American diplomats scrambled across neutral capitals. In Stockholm, frantic talks began about securing Scandinavian neutrality, or perhaps assistance. In Bern, Swiss officials reinforced their bunkers, but refused to choose sides. In Vatican City, the Pope called for an immediate ceasefire, a plea that vanished into the static of falling bombs. Meanwhile, in Soviet-occupied territory, propaganda leaflets fell from the skies. In blocky Cyrillic and translated German, they promised bread, order, and liberation from Anglo-American imperialism. Some believed them, some burned them. Most simply tried to survive. By January 25th, the Red Army had pushed nearly 100 kilometers past the German border. Frankfurt was under full occupation. Mainz and Wiesbaden had fallen. American military liaisons urged the evacuation of NATO headquarters from Paris. The Rhine, that ancient dividing line, now stood as the last geographic barrier before France. But geography would not be enough. In Washington, President Truman faced the gravest question of his presidency. Mobilization was inevitable. But time was gone. The only question remaining was how much of Europe could be saved, and at what cost, and what came next was even more unexpected. The morning of January 28, 1950, dawned with the Rhine River cloaked in mist and smoke. From Cologne to Karlsruhe, the water trembled under the roar of tank engines. Soviet engineers had worked through the night to assemble pontoon bridges, while artillery units shelled defensive positions on the western bank. On the other side, NATO forces, fragmented and desperate, made their final stand. The Rhine had long been Europe's natural line of defense. For centuries, it separated powers and preserved borders. But rivers don't stop tanks, and history does not favor the unprepared. In Strasbourg, French troops, mostly colonial regiments and reservists, had dug into 1930s-era fortifications left over from the Maginot Line. They were never meant to face modern warfare. Soviet forward units launched their assault at 5:20 a.m., bypassing strongholds entirely with helicopters and amphibious vehicles. By midday, the eastern outskirts of Strasbourg were burning. By nightfall, the tricolor flag had been torn down from the city hall. Across the river in Germany, Cologne had become a battlefield. The city's ancient cathedral stood defiant amid the rubble, but Soviet artillery didn't care for symbolism. Civilians huddled in the crypts below, while T-54 tanks rumbled through the streets above. American units from the 1st Infantry Division rushed in from France, fought valiantly, but without air support and supply lines, they were forced into a fighting retreat. It was the same across the front. French armored units crumbled under the weight of Soviet formations, outgunned and outpaced. NATO's lines weren't lines anymore. They were scattered outposts clinging to survival. In Paris, panic took hold. Radio stations began preparing for relocation. The French Assembly went into emergency session beneath the shadow of German rockets. Rumors flew. Was Paris next? Would the Soviets cross the Seine? Were communist cells already in the capital? Meanwhile, Stalin watched the advance from Moscow with measured satisfaction. Operation Vesna was exceeding expectations. He had expected pockets of resistance. Instead, he found only confusion. He directed Beria to step up intelligence operations in France and Italy, sowing chaos in cities through targeted bombings and psychological warfare. But the Soviet leader underestimated one thing: resolve. In the French countryside, something stirred. Villagers took up arms. Local mayors coordinated with remnants of the military to form militias. Resistance networks, some still connected to YPG partisans, reactivated. Roads were sabotaged. Bridges collapsed behind retreating NATO units. French communists attempted to organize strikes in solidarity with the Red Army, only to be met with violent clashes from nationalist mobs. The ideological battle Stalin hoped to win without effort was proving bloodier than expected. Back in London, Churchill faced growing pressure to act. Britain's Home Guard was reactivated, and troop transports began departing Southampton bound for Normandy. Still haunted by Dunkirk, Churchill refused to retreat from Europe again. He called President Truman directly, bypassing diplomats. "We must send a signal, Harry. If Paris falls without a fight, the Iron Curtain will cover the whole of Europe." Truman, eyes hollow from lack of sleep, gave the green light. Operation Iron Shield was activated. Within hours, convoys of American troops, tanks, and supplies began streaming from ports in Virginia and New York toward the battered continent. But they would not arrive in time to save the Rhineland. On January 31st, Soviet forces secured their final bridgehead across the river. The Rhine, once a symbol of Western defense, now ran red. Still, as the Soviet flag was raised over the ruins of Mainz, resistance did not end. It began, and the fire spreading through Europe would soon burn far beyond the battlefield. February 1st, 1950. Snow fell lightly over Paris as church bells rang in a new month. But the city was a shell of its former self, gripped by dread, awaiting a storm. French newspapers were censored. Rationing had resumed. The government broadcasted promises of defense, but the sound of boots on pavement was louder. Everyone knew the Soviets were coming. But not everyone planned to flee. Beneath the cobbled streets of Montmartre, in wine cellars and maintenance tunnels, a different France was awakening, one not waiting for rescue, but preparing to fight. What began as whispers in taverns had become action. By the first week of February, Resistance cells were forming not just in occupied zones, but in free ones too. Former soldiers, students, railway workers, and ex-Gaullist partisans, they called themselves le feu souterrain, the underground flame. Their first act was symbolic. On the night of February 2nd, all streetlights in the 11th arrondissement were shut off, simultaneously. Soviet operatives stationed in Parisian embassies took note. 2 days later, a rail convoy transporting Red Army fuel supplies to the front was derailed near Reims. It was no accident. The Soviet advance was now encountering friction, not from tanks or organized armies, but from shadows. In towns like Metz and Nancy, leaflets appeared overnight, warning collaborators to leave. In Dijon, power was cut to Soviet-controlled garrisons for hours. Radio stations in Corsica broadcast encrypted resistance messages to listeners across the country. And this spirit wasn't confined to France. In Belgium, strikes broke out at the port of Antwerp, halting Soviet-bound supply chains. In the Netherlands, students staged sit-ins in solidarity with Germany's occupied cities. In Italy, the political left split violently, communists marching in favor of Soviet liberation, while socialists and centrists clashed with them in the streets. The ideological fault lines that Stalin had hoped to exploit were becoming civil fractures. Yet while fire grew below, the war above pressed forward. In the Bavarian Alps, American paratroopers, the vanguard of Operation Iron Shield, launched daring nighttime raids on Soviet artillery positions. The terrain favored them, but the numbers did not. Every bridge they destroyed was rebuilt within a day. Every position captured came at enormous cost. Still, they bought time, and time now was everything. Inside NATO headquarters, recently relocated to Lyon, panic had begun to give way to clarity. Supreme Commander General Matthew Ridgway took command of the unified defense effort. His assessment was grim. The Soviets had committed over 800,000 troops to the offensive. Western Europe had only a fraction of that, poorly equipped and poorly positioned. But Ridgway also understood something Stalin didn't. While the Soviets fought for territory, the Allies were now fighting for survival. New alliances began forming. Sweden, though officially neutral, allowed covert refueling of NATO aircraft. Spain, under Franco, sent volunteer divisions to help defend southern France. Even Switzerland, long isolated, began massing troops on its borders and sheltering defectors. Europe, fractured and wounded, was beginning to coalesce, not under ideology, but under threat. In Moscow, Stalin grew impatient. Strasbourg had not yet fallen completely. Paris remained defiant. Beria reported rising unrest in Poland and East Germany. Red Army generals requested more resources or permission to escalate. Escalation meant one thing: airstrikes on urban centers. On February 7th, the first Soviet bombers crossed into central France. Limoges, a railway hub, was firebombed. Hundreds died. The West was no longer just fighting an army. They were confronting a doctrine that had learned from Stalingrad, and now intended to return the favor. Still, even as smoke rose from the French countryside, so too did the resolve of its people. A new message began circulating in coded pamphlets, scrawled across walls, and whispered in alleyways. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. And for the first time since the invasion began, Soviet commanders began to wonder, not how far they could go, but how long they could hold what they'd already taken. February 9th, 1950. The skies over the Bay of Biscay churned with storm clouds, but beneath them sailed salvation. Convoys of American, Canadian, and British ships approached French ports under constant fear of submarine attacks. They carried men, tanks, ammunition, and something more intangible: hope. At the head of this transatlantic surge was the 82nd Airborne Division, followed by elements of the U.S. 3rd Armored and British 1st Infantry Divisions. Operation Iron Shield, now fully underway, was NATO's first true act of war. And it wasn't about reclaiming land. Not yet. It was about survival. Stabilization, holding the line before the continent, fell entirely. Their arrival in Brest and Saint-Nazaire was met with a mixture of applause and desperation. French civilians, some waving flags, others waving bread, watched columns of Allied troops disembark in silence. For many, the memory of the previous liberation was still fresh. For others, this was the first time they had ever seen an American. The war had entered its second phase, attrition. General Ridgway set up headquarters near Tours, selecting the Loire River as the new defensive spine of Western Europe. Engineers worked day and night reinforcing bridges, railways, and field hospitals. Airfields were converted from farmland. Thousands of volunteers joined French militias and local defense units. The American military brought with it not just force, but order and food. But the Red Army was not slowing down. In the east, Soviet columns pressed into Alsace and Lorraine. Strasbourg remained under siege. Though the Soviets claimed they were liberating the city, what they unleashed instead was a humanitarian catastrophe. With supply lines overstretched and local populations uncooperative, Soviet troops resorted to mass requisitions. Resistance fighters, embedded in the city's underground, launched ambushes on patrols and assassinated officers. The KGB responded with swift and brutal reprisals, summary executions, block raids, forced deportations to East Germany. From Berlin to Bordeaux, Soviet propaganda broadcast a single message. Capitalism was collapsing. But on the ground, the message was clearer. Europe was not going quietly. In Britain, conscription was reintroduced. Churchill's fiery speeches lit up every radio and cinema. We did not cross the oceans of blood and ash in 945, only to surrender now to a colder tyranny, he declared in Manchester. Factories in Glasgow and Birmingham roared back to life. RAF squadrons scrambled nightly, providing what little air support they could to battered French towns. The United States, meanwhile, was undergoing a transformation. Congress passed the Emergency Defense Mobilization Act. The draft was reinstated. War bonds were issued. The American public, weary from Korea, now found themselves watching Europe fall in real time. Newsreels showed black smoke pouring over Frankfurt, villages razed in Lorraine, and American graves already dotting the fields of Champagne. The emotional shift was rapid and irreversible. Across the Atlantic, Latin America watched with growing unease. Brazil closed its ports to Soviet-aligned vessels. Argentina quietly began communications with NATO. In Asia, China, itself barely a year into communist rule, issued a guarded statement supporting the People's March against imperialism. Behind the curtain, Soviet diplomats began probing Beijing for more. In Moscow, the tone had changed. Stalin, though outwardly confident, now demanded answers. Why does Paris still stand? He reportedly asked during a midnight briefing. Beria blamed Western propaganda. Zhukov warned of overextension. Soviet industry, though vast, was struggling to maintain the tempo of war outside its borders. Fuel convoys stretched across Poland were increasingly targeted by NATO air raids and Polish sabotage teams. Partisans in East Germany began blowing up rail depots. The Red Army was bleeding, not fatally, but slowly. Still, the Soviet machine rolled on. February 12th saw coordinated airstrikes on Lyon and Clermont-Ferrand. Dozens of civilian buildings were destroyed. NATO intelligence stations were hit. But unlike Limoges the week before, this time anti-aircraft batteries stood ready. Soviet planes were downed in droves, some by French gunners, others by American jets from the USS Coral Sea, recently arrived in the Atlantic. NATO finally had a counterpunch. By mid-February, the line had stabilized along the Loire River. Though sporadic Soviet breakthroughs occurred, they were no longer unchecked. The Iron Shield was holding. But no one believed that holding would be enough. Not for long. And as Allied forces dug trenches into frozen French soil, a new realization crept into the minds of generals and citizens alike. This was not just a war for Europe's borders. It was a war for the direction of the human future, and the battle for Paris had yet to begin. February 17, 1950. A low fog blanketed the Seine, muffling the sounds of a capital preparing for war. Paris had not known this kind of silence since 1944, a silence filled with anticipation, dread, and resolve. The City of Light had become a city of sandbags, steel barricades, and whispered prayers. By now, Soviet forces had captured much of northeastern France. From Reims to Troyes, the Red Army had carved a brutal corridor toward the French heartland. But their advance was slowing. Each kilometer came at a higher cost. Each town left behind birthed a new cell of resistance. Soviet supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, with partisan attacks severing communications and blowing railways. The forward units had the firepower, but the ground beneath their treads was becoming hostile. And yet, the Soviet high command pressed on. Because Stalin had made up his mind, Paris had to fall. To the world, it was more than a city. It was a symbol of the West, of culture, of defiance. If Red Army boots touched the Champs-Élysées, the psychological impact would echo from Washington to Buenos Aires. Moscow would declare ideological victory without ever dropping a nuclear bomb. Operation Zvezda, Star, was launched with one purpose: surround and subdue the French capital. Red Army troops advanced from the east and southeast, aiming to encircle Paris from both sides of the Marne. Tank brigades pushed through Meaux, while infantry columns slogged through the forests of Fontainebleau. The roads were mined. Bridges had been blown. French and British engineers worked night and day to slow the advance. American artillery units dug into the hills surrounding Versailles, preparing for what all knew was coming, a siege unlike any since 1870. Inside Paris, the city mobilized itself. Civilian volunteers filled sandbags and reinforced metro tunnels as makeshift shelters. The Eiffel Tower was shrouded in camouflage netting. The Louvre was emptied, priceless artifacts evacuated to the south under heavy guard. Food was rationed. Blood banks were overwhelmed. Every able-bodied citizen was given a role. A new slogan was born from the graffiti of a student in the Latin Quarter: Paris meurt, mais Paris ne plie pas. Paris dies, but Paris does not bend. General Ridgway, coordinating from Lyon, committed everything he had to the defense of the capital. The 101st Airborne was deployed to Orly and Evry. British Gurkhas were flown in from Cyprus. Canadian tank battalions joined French regulars on the city's southern perimeter. The Americans called the defensive line the cordon. The French had a simpler word for it: la dernière chance, the last chance. And then, on the night of February 20th, the bombardment began. Soviet Katyusha rockets lit up the sky east of Paris. Waves of shellfire rained down on the suburbs of Vincennes and Montreuil. Fires spread uncontrollably through working-class districts. Hospitals overflowed. Soviet planes screamed overhead, targeting communication hubs and railway stations. But the city did not fall. Instead, it fought back. French and British anti-aircraft crews downed dozens of bombers. NATO artillery batteries returned fire from fortified positions along the Seine. American fighter squadrons engaged in dogfights above the Bois de Vincennes, and in the alleys of the 19th arrondissement, resistance fighters ambushed Soviet forward units attempting infiltration, vanishing into the dark before anyone could trace the gunshots. February 22nd. Soviet infantry reached the eastern city limits. Street fighting erupted, house to house, brick to brick. The Red Army had expected a symbolic victory. What they received was a brutal urban quagmire. Every district had its own defenders. Every metro line became a supply route. Police, bakers, priests, even nuns. Everyone fought. And still, the Soviets pushed inward. On February 24th, the front reached the Place de la Nation. The metro collapsed under shelling. Parisians refused to evacuate. The mayor, killed in a direct hit, was buried in the rubble of the city hall he refused to leave. Churchill, speaking by radio, quoted Napoleon, "The courage of the French has outlived their kings, and today it must outlive tyranny." But beneath the heroism, NATO planners saw something else, a problem. Paris could not hold forever. Ridgway knew that if the city were reduced to rubble, The moral victory would belong not to the West, but to the Kremlin. They needed a breakthrough, not just in the defense, but in the offensive. And on February 25th, NATO's first counterattack was launched, not in Paris, but to the north. Near Amiens, Allied forces initiated Operation Halberd, a massive flanking maneuver designed to cut off the Soviet forces encircling Paris from behind. American tanks, British commandos, and remnants of the Free Polish Armored Brigade surged forward through narrow roads and frozen farmland. The Soviets had not expected this. Their own rear guard, stretched thin and undersupplied, began to crack. Suddenly, the siege of Paris was no longer a closed trap. It was a noose, tightening both ways. And as the first NATO tanks rolled into the ruins of Meaux, one thing became clear. Paris would not fall quietly. And neither, it seemed, would the free world. February 26, 1950. Just before dawn, a column of British Cromwell tanks roared across the frost-covered plains near Beauvais. Engines howled, treads churned through frozen earth, and infantry clung to their sides, eyes sharp with purpose. Operation Halberd was no longer a flanking attempt. It was a rescue. NATO's counterattack north of Paris had caught the Soviets off guard. For weeks, the Red Army had been focused on smashing its way into the capital, throwing men and machines into the grinding urban fight. But in doing so, it had extended its lines dangerously far, pushing its supply depots and logistical hubs well beyond secure territory. The strike through Amiens had been meant to distract. Instead, it broke something. Soviet field commanders scrambled to respond. Their forward positions around Paris were suddenly unsupported. Ammunition ran low. Fuel convoys were ambushed by Allied aircraft and French saboteurs. NATO's mechanized thrust, spearheaded by American Sherman and Pershing tanks, bolstered by the British 7th Armored Division, smashed into the Soviet rear guard near Compiègne. Within 48 hours, 3 Soviet motor rifle divisions were either destroyed or forced to withdraw. Entire regiments surrendered in isolated villages, trapped without command or resupply. French resistance groups, long operating in secret, now rose in open rebellion across the occupied countryside. In Chantilly, hundreds of civilians seized Soviet munitions stores and turned them over to NATO troops. Inside Paris, the sudden shift was palpable. The constant artillery barrage faltered. Soviet air support thinned. NATO radio signals grew stronger. Whispers traveled fast in the underground. The line is breaking. They're pulling back. But the Red Army was not defeated. Not yet. General Vasily Chuikov, commander of Soviet forces in France, launched a brutal countermeasure. He ordered scorched earth tactics in retreating zones, bridges blown, towns razed, civilians forcibly relocated. Soviet troops withdrew from the outskirts of Versailles and Vincennes, but left only destruction behind. In the Parisian suburb of Saint-Denis, whole blocks were torched to prevent NATO use. Still, the momentum had changed. February 28th marked a historic moment. NATO forces entered Paris. It began with a French armored column breaking through weakened Soviet lines near Montreuil. By noon, American paratroopers had linked with French resistance in the 12th arrondissement. British sappers worked to clear mines from metro tunnels. Civilians poured into the streets waving Allied flags, singing La Marseillaise. Cries of Vive la France! Vive l'Amérique! Echoed through ruined boulevards. But the victory was bittersweet. The eastern districts of the city were flattened. Casualty figures soared past 80,000. Monuments had crumbled. Churches were scarred by artillery, and the Eiffel Tower, though still standing, bore the burn marks of nearby explosions. Still, for the first time in over a month, Paris breathed without fear of bombardment. Church bells rang on March 1st, not in celebration, but in mourning and defiance. General Ridgway, touring the devastated city, delivered a statement from the steps of the Palais Bourbon. Let it be known to every nation, free or otherwise, that Paris stands. And if Paris stands, Europe stands. But even as NATO liberated the capital, intelligence reports painted a darker picture. The Soviets were regrouping. In the east, near Nancy and Metz, fresh divisions were arriving from Poland and Ukraine. A second wave was coming. Stalin had not abandoned France. He was doubling down. Inside the Kremlin, the mood was volcanic. Stalin berated his generals in front of the Politburo. "You lost Paris to farmers and school teachers," he spat. He blamed Beria for internal resistance, blamed Zhukov for the failed siege, blamed the West for propaganda victories, but behind his fury was calculation. If conventional war could not break NATO, then another approach would. Beria proposed a massive campaign of subversion, not military, but psychological. The Soviet Union would flood liberated cities with spies, saboteurs, and infiltrators. Disinformation, targeted assassinations, political destabilization. A war fought not with tanks, but with shadows. Stalin agreed, and while NATO celebrated in Paris, the seeds of a new conflict were already being sown in secret. For even as one front closed, another began to open, this time not across a battlefield, but inside the fragile heart of the West itself. March 3, 1950. From Paris to Lyon, from Antwerp to Geneva, victory banners still fluttered in the chilly wind, but below the surface, a different war had already begun. One without front lines, one that could not be won with tanks or airstrikes. The Red Army may have retreated from Paris, but the Soviet Union had not withdrawn its influence. Operation Sturm Tischina, Storm Silence, was now underway, a doctrine born not from military maps, but from the mind of Lavrentiy Beria. Where tanks had failed to conquer the West, he believed confusion, chaos, and mistrust could. Across liberated France, Soviet sleepers activated. Some were agents planted long before the war began. Others were fresh infiltrators who had slipped in during the chaos. Soldiers in civilian clothing, trained in assassination, sabotage, and political manipulation. Their mission was not to hold territory, but to poison it. The first sign came in Lyon. On March 5th, a coordinated attack targeted a NATO fuel depot and command node. Simultaneously, false documents were released implicating Italian operatives in the blast. Within hours, French newspapers were publishing headlines accusing Rome of betrayal. Riots broke out. Only after 2 days did Allied investigators uncover Soviet fingerprints. But the damage was done. Trust within NATO, still fragile and hastily formed, began to erode. Elsewhere, sabotage became commonplace. Rail lines mysteriously failed. Ammunition shipments exploded in convoys. Assassinations of pro-Western mayors and clergy spread fear through recently liberated areas. The Paris police force, partially reformed but still vulnerable, was infiltrated at multiple levels. In one chilling case, an American officer's hotel was bombed by a concierge he had come to know by name. The psychological toll was devastating. Civilians who had just survived the siege now found themselves uncertain whom to trust. Rumors swirled. Collaborators hiding in plain sight, American soldiers looting churches, British officers arming fascist cells. Most were lies, but enough truth, or enough violence, made people believe. General Ridgway ordered a full counterintelligence mobilization. American OSS veterans, British MI6 teams, and the French Bureau Central de Renseignement et d'Action, BCRA, were brought under one tent. Operation Lanterne. It was Europe's last flickering flame against the coming darkness. In Geneva, NATO's political leaders convened behind closed doors. The goal was unity, but fractures were growing. Belgium was hesitant to send more troops. The Dutch insisted on fortifying their borders. Italy feared internal revolt from communists emboldened by Moscow's rhetoric. Only Britain and the US remained fully committed, and even they began to realize the war had mutated beyond conventional terms. Meanwhile, Stalin shifted gears. Though furious over the loss of Paris, he saw in Beria's methods a longer, more enduring form of war. He greenlit expanded efforts in neutral and fragile nations. In Greece, communist guerrillas in the Peloponnese received fresh arms. In Turkey, ethnic unrest flared in Kurdish regions. In Austria, which remained neutral, Soviet diplomats launched a campaign to destabilize the fragile post-war balance. But nowhere was the campaign more dangerous than inside West Germany. Still without a formal military, still bearing the scars of Nazism, the German people were split. Many welcomed NATO's defense, but others, particularly in the industrial Ruhr and divided Berlin, felt caught in a tug-of-war between ideologies. Soviet agents fanned the flames. Factories were bombed. Labor strikes turned violent. Berlin, split by occupation zones, teetered on the edge of open insurrection. In response, Truman authorized a bold and controversial move: the rearmament of West Germany. It was a gamble. Memories of the Wehrmacht were still raw. France opposed it vehemently. Britain was cautious, but the logic was unavoidable. If Western Europe was to survive, Germany had to stand. Thus, in secret, German officers from the old Wehrmacht, carefully vetted, quietly recruited, were flown to London and Washington for strategic consultations. It was a risky step, but one the West could no longer afford to delay. By March 15th, the tide of Soviet psychological warfare had begun to slow. Operation Lanterne scored major successes. 2 high-ranking Soviet operatives were captured in Lyon. A major cell in Brussels was exposed. Documents recovered from a KGB safehouse revealed plans for an assassination attempt on Charles de Gaulle, now emerging from political retirement to rally the French right. The leak changed everything. For the first time, the public saw the scale of the Soviet infiltration. Protests turned. Mobs that once chanted "Yankees go home" now demanded Soviet spies be hunted. NATO's unity, briefly shaken, solidified in renewed fury. And just in time, because in the east, near the Franco-German border, Soviet armored formations were massing once again. This time, not for Paris. This time, for the Channel. And the Allies would soon realize that while the shadows had been dangerous, the storm to come would be far more devastating. March 20th, 1950. The spring thaw came late to northern France, and with it came something colder than winter: war renewed. NATO intelligence, still reeling from weeks of sabotage, now confirmed their fears. Satellite photography, a gift from American U-2 flights at high altitude, showed unmistakable signs. Armored columns redeploying east of the Moselle, rail corridors flooded with fuel convoys, and artillery placements lining up not toward Paris, but toward Normandy. The Soviet Union wasn't retreating. It was pivoting. The goal was now clear: cut through northern France, bypass the NATO strongholds in the interior, and reach the English Channel. If Soviet forces captured the port cities, Rouen, Le Havre, Cherbourg, they could sever Britain's ability to reinforce the continent. Worse, they could position ballistic missiles within striking range of southern England. It was audacious, brutal, and Stalin believed it was his last chance to win before American industrial might reach full mobilization. Operation Trident, as NATO called it, began with thunder. On March 23rd, Soviet artillery lit up the horizon east of Caen. Thousands of shells pounded defensive lines manned by a patchwork of American, Canadian, and Free French units. Soviet T-54s surged through the wreckage of Orne Valley towns, their turrets scanning burned-out ruins for signs of resistance. Unlike the grinding siege of Paris, this was blitzkrieg in reverse. Fast, focused, unforgiving. The Allies were caught off guard. Supply chains had only just stabilized after the battle for Paris. Most reinforcements were still being offloaded in southern ports. Air superiority was contested daily. And yet, NATO command refused to break. From London, Churchill ordered every available British warship into the Channel to guard against amphibious threats. The RAF doubled its sorties. American generals, fearing another collapse, ordered emergency redeployment of the 4th and 9th Infantry Divisions to plug gaps near Rouen. Entire towns were evacuated in hours. Bridges were rigged for demolition. The French countryside once again became a battlefield. Every hedge a hiding place, every road a death trap. But the Soviets had learned from their mistakes. This time, they moved with discipline. Mobile anti-aircraft units protected their flanks. Engineers rapidly repaired damaged rail lines. Soviet snipers operated deep behind enemy lines, assassinating officers and forward observers. Even the Red Army's once haphazard logistics had improved, thanks to captured French rail infrastructure and conscripted local labor. By March 27th, the Soviets had reached the Seine. The world watched, horrified. Radio Free Europe broadcast hourly updates. In New York, Times Square ran a live map on the front of its buildings. In Ottawa and Canberra, parliaments convened emergency war sessions. Across South America, governments debated sanctions. Japan offered to send logistical support. Even neutral Sweden opened its ports for NATO vessels, a symbolic move that enraged the Kremlin. But symbolism wasn't enough to stop Soviet armor. On March 28th, Le Havre came under siege. The French Navy, desperate to prevent a port capture, scuttled half its remaining fleet. Civilian ships were evacuated under fire. American warships bombarded Soviet positions from offshore, but by then, it was street-to-street fighting. Flames rose into the sky. Refugees filled the roads westward. Then came the breaking point. At the edge of Cherbourg, Soviet Spetsnaz units, elite commandos, infiltrated Allied airfields. Dozens of planes were destroyed on the ground. Communications were severed. Local command collapsed. For a brief window, it looked as if Stalin would get his Channel Corridor, a fortified Soviet belt stretching from Calais to Caen, capable of choking Britain and flanking the rest of Western Europe. And then, on March 30th, everything changed. It began with a low rumble over the Bay of Biscay. A shadow fell over the coast. From the west came the largest aerial armada since D-Day, Operation Lion's Hammer. Hundreds of American B-29 and British Lancaster bombers swept in over Soviet-held territory, supported by jet fighters from carriers stationed near the Azores. The Allies had waited, prepared, measured their strike, and they struck with fury. In a matter of hours, Soviet fuel depots were incinerated. Bridges collapsed. Tank columns were bombed into twisted wreckage. The 3rd Guards Tank Army, the spearhead of the Channel Drive, was decimated outside Lisieux. Red Army troops who had nearly tasted victory found themselves cut off, starving, bombarded from every direction. By April 1st, the tide had turned again. Soviet commanders, facing encirclement, ordered a partial withdrawal. Thousands of troops, injured, hungry, disillusioned, streamed eastward, pursued by Allied forces and hounded by the very civilians they once sought to liberate. Still, the Channel Dream was not dead, not yet. In the Kremlin, Stalin raged, but refused retreat. He ordered one final push toward Calais, one last roll of the dice. But his generals, his economy, and even his soldiers were reaching a breaking point. And while the tanks rolled east, another force, colder and deadlier than any before, began moving into position. Because behind the battles, behind the rubble and flags and maps, a darker question was beginning to dominate every war room. Would nuclear fire follow if conventional war failed? And if it did, who would strike first? April 2nd, 1950. The war had changed again, but this time, not in its shape or direction. It had changed in its nature. The Channel Drive had been blunted. Operation Lion's Hammer had wrecked Soviet momentum, and NATO forces were now reclaiming territory along the Seine and the Normandy coast. But even as cheers rose in Rouen and Allied tanks rolled into Caen, no one was celebrating. Something unspoken hung in the air, not victory, but dread. For the first time since the war began, the word nuclear was spoken in open session. It started in Washington. In an emergency meeting at the White House, President Truman, now visibly aged and deeply burdened, faced his Joint Chiefs. A newly decrypted intelligence report suggested that the Soviet Union had deployed tactical nuclear weapons to forward bases in Czechoslovakia and Belarus. The weapons weren't armed, but they were mobile, and they were close enough to reach Lyon, Munich, or even Brussels within hours. The Joint Chiefs wanted deterrence. Secretary of Defense Louis Johnson proposed moving American nuclear-capable bombers to airfields in the UK and Spain. General Curtis LeMay went further. He advocated for a preemptive strike on Soviet logistics hubs in Poland. Truman hesitated. He still bore the scars of Hiroshima. He knew the weight of the decision. In London, Churchill took a different tone. He addressed the House of Commons with thunderous clarity. If the iron hand of Stalin believes it can wield fire, then let him know. Fire answers fire. We do not seek the ash heap of civilization, but we shall not retreat into it alone. The British Parliament voted overwhelmingly to authorize joint nuclear contingency planning with the United States. RAF bombers were refitted. American B-36s began flying patrols over the Atlantic. Their bellies loaded not with hope, but with hydrogen. NATO was no longer just defending land. It was now defending existence itself. The Soviet Union responded in kind. On April 4th, in a broadcast delivered across Radio Moscow, Foreign Minister Vyshinsky declared, "Should the capitalist aggressors escalate beyond conventional war, they will invite devastation not seen in human memory. The Soviet people are ready for any sacrifice." The message was clear. The Kremlin would not blink. In the shadows, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction was forming, not yet named, not yet formalized, but alive in every strategy memo and battlefield order. The civilian world reacted with fear. In Copenhagen and Zurich, citizens queued for iodine tablets. In Dublin and Lisbon, protests erupted demanding their countries remain neutral. In America, school children were once again taught to duck under their desks, but deep down, no one believed desks could stop firestorms. Even within NATO, tensions spiked. France, devastated and exhausted, pushed for negotiations. Italy warned of withdrawal. Canada lobbied for a ceasefire proposal at the United Nations. But the memory of Soviet occupation was fresh in the hearts of too many. No one could trust that Stalin would stop if given breathing room. And Stalin, isolated and paranoid, grew more volatile by the day. In the Kremlin, his aides noticed his change. He spoke often of betrayal, of sabotage. He accused Beria of failure, threatened to purge the general staff, and ordered tighter control of press and radio. He doubled down on threats of escalation, even as his field commanders quietly reported low morale, ammunition shortages, and logistical collapse. In Berlin, the Red Army had begun to pull back, not because of diplomacy, but because of sheer exhaustion. Partisan attacks in East Germany were paralyzing supply lines. Soviet soldiers, many as young as 17, were dying in ambushes they couldn't anticipate. Entire villages had become nests of resistance. Berlin itself simmered, the western sectors preparing for a final stand, the Soviet sector unraveling from within. By mid-April, an uneasy stillness descended across the front. Not peace, but pause. The Soviets had stopped advancing, NATO had stopped retreating. Both sides dug in, watched, and waited. And then came April 17th. At 2:12 a.m., 3 Soviet bombers breached Norwegian airspace heading toward the North Sea. They were intercepted by RAF fighters before crossing into British airspace. No bombs were dropped. No shots were fired. But inside each Soviet plane was a single warhead, unarmed but live. It was a test, a provocation, a warning. Back in Washington, Truman met alone with General Omar Bradley. There, in the stillness of the Oval Office, he whispered, "If they cross the line, we won't have a choice, will we?" Bradley, who had once led the liberation of Europe, said nothing, because he knew the next liberation might come in the form of radioactive dust. And still, across the trenches of France, the forests of Bavaria, and the streets of Prague, soldiers waited, not for orders, but for fate. And on the other side of the world, in the halls of Beijing, a new voice entered the fray, one that neither Truman nor Stalin had accounted for. And what came next would pull the war into a global firestorm. April 20th, 1950, while Europe smoldered and Washington braced for nuclear war, another silence broke, not in the West, not in the East, but far to the southeast. behind bamboo curtains and red flags. In Beijing, the People's Republic of China made its move. Chairman Mao Zedong had been watching the European conflict with hawk-eyed patience. For months, China had remained officially neutral, offering vague rhetorical support for anti-imperial struggles while consolidating internal power. The Chinese Civil War had only recently ended. The People's Liberation Army was still absorbing a fractured nation, but Mao understood power and opportunity, and Europe's disintegration was his opportunity. On April 21st, Chinese state radio broadcast a carefully worded statement: "The Chinese people will not stand idle while global imperialist aggression threatens the peace of humanity." That same day, Chinese ambassadors met with Soviet representatives in Ulaanbaatar. Intelligence sources in Taipei, Tokyo, and Moscow confirmed it. China was preparing to intervene. Not with bombs, not with tanks, with leverage. Mao had no interest in fighting NATO directly. What he wanted was control of the narrative, of the diplomatic balance, and of the emerging post-war order. His strategy was threefold. 1. Apply pressure on the Soviet Union to end the war on favorable communist terms. 2. Position China as the moral voice of the socialist world. 3. Exploit Western fear of a second front to extract territorial and political concessions in Asia. The response in Moscow was mixed. Stalin was livid. He considered Mao a junior partner at best, unpredictable, unreliable, and too bold. But he also knew the Red Army was stretched to the limit, and Chinese support, even symbolic, could tip the geopolitical balance. So he agreed to negotiations. On April 23rd, Soviet and Chinese envoys signed the Joint Declaration of Socialist Solidarity. Publicly, it was a meaningless declaration of unity. Privately, it contained chilling provisions: joint development of nuclear weapons, intelligence sharing in Asia and the Pacific, and, most importantly, a coordinated pressure campaign to fracture the West. What followed was chaos. In Korea, Chinese troops began massing along the 38th parallel. American forces, already thinly stretched across Europe, went on high alert. The U.S. Navy repositioned carrier groups in the Sea of Japan. In Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek pleaded for American protection. In Tokyo, Japanese officials began constructing fallout shelters beneath government buildings. In Vietnam and Burma, Chinese operatives funneled arms and money to nationalist and communist insurgents. In India, border tensions flared near Tibet. Every move forced the West to reconsider its focus. Could NATO afford to fight on two fronts, East and West? Mao had not fired a shot, but he had already changed the game. In Washington, Truman now faced his darkest hour. The European war had escalated to the brink of atomic destruction. China was flexing across Asia, and the American public, though still supportive, was growing restless. Protests began in San Francisco and Chicago. Labor strikes paralyzed Baltimore. Editorials in the New York Times questioned whether the defense of Europe was worth a third world war. And yet, behind closed doors, another plan took shape. The National Security Council, working with British and French intelligence, began drafting Operation Mercury, a strategy not to win the war through conquest, but through fracture. The target, the Soviet Union itself. Western analysts knew what Stalin feared most: not NATO tanks in Poland, not American bombers over Moscow. Internal revolt. The CIA began coordinating with anti-Soviet resistance networks across Eastern Europe. In East Germany, pamphlets and weapons were dropped via nighttime air runs. In Ukraine, nationalist cells rearmed. In the Baltics, partisans emerged from the forests. Even in Soviet Central Asia, whispers of rebellion were growing. Operation Mercury was not about territory. It was about time, and pressure. And then, the unexpected happened. On April 27th, a massive explosion ripped through a Soviet nuclear weapons facility outside Sverdlovsk. The Kremlin claimed it was an accident. NATO suspected sabotage. The truth was more complex: a combination of worker sabotage and an aging reactor. But the effect was seismic. For the first time, the Soviet people saw the consequences of war not just abroad, but at home. Protests broke out in Novosibirsk. Strikes paralyzed transport hubs in Leningrad. The illusion of invincibility shattered. Stalin ordered mass arrests. Thousands vanished overnight. But fear no longer silenced everyone. Inside the Politburo, murmurs of doubt surfaced. Beria urged diplomatic channels be reopened. Molotov warned that the Chinese alliance could backfire. Even Zhukov, the Iron Marshal, hinted that the war had become unsustainable. And yet, Stalin refused to yield. Because to yield was to die. But the question now wasn't just whether the Soviet Union could win, it was whether it could even survive. And on May 1st, 1950, as NATO leaders convened in London for an emergency summit, a new message arrived, not from Moscow, not from Washington, but from within Soviet-controlled Prague. The people have risen. And what came after was even more unexpected. May 1st, 1950, International Workers' Day, once a proud celebration of socialist unity, became the day the world changed again. And perhaps, this time, for good. It began with a whisper, then a gunshot, then a siren. In Prague, the heart of Soviet-controlled Czechoslovakia, the uprising was neither planned nor coordinated by generals. It was born in the desperation of students, factory workers, and disillusioned soldiers. The city had been simmering for weeks. Soviet crackdowns had intensified. Food was rationed. Radio broadcasts censored. Resistance leaflets had begun to appear in train stations and cafes. The people were no longer afraid. They were hungry, tired, and angry. At 10:42 a.m., a student protest outside the Charles University was fired upon by Soviet troops. 3 died. But instead of fleeing, the crowd surged. Police were overwhelmed. Arms were seized from barracks. By mid-afternoon, gunfire echoed through Wenceslas Square. Soviet officers were dragged from their trucks. The red banner above the Parliament building was pulled down. By sunset, the city was in open rebellion, and the world watched. NATO intelligence picked up the transmissions first, amateur radio operators transmitting crude but unmistakable messages. Prague is rising, Soviet command collapsing, we are not alone. The images that followed, smuggled via neutral journalists and resistance photographers, sent shockwaves across Europe. Prague, under Soviet occupation since the war's start, was now fighting for its freedom. Spontaneously, from within. And just like that, the war shifted. In Warsaw, tens of thousands marched in defiance. In Budapest, statues of Stalin were torn down in the night. In Bucharest, Romanian soldiers refused orders to fire on civilians. The Iron Curtain, once solid and cold, began to crack. NATO reacted with caution, and then decisively. On May 3rd, President Truman issued the Prague Directive. NATO would offer immediate humanitarian aid, strategic intelligence, and covert support to any Eastern Bloc city that rose against Moscow. It was not a declaration of invasion. It was a declaration of hope. Supplies were airlifted into the Prague countryside by British and American cargo planes under the cover of night. Radio Free Europe established direct communication with resistance leaders. NATO paratroopers, officially off-duty, unofficially authorized, crossed into Czechoslovakia under civilian cover, training insurgents in sabotage and urban tactics. Inside the Kremlin, panic reigned. Stalin saw ghosts everywhere, in his cabinet, his officers, even his own guards. He ordered a nationwide blackout of foreign broadcasts. The KGB launched a sweeping purge of disloyal elements. Beria suggested nuclear escalation against NATO supply lines in Austria. Zhukov warned it would invite full retaliation, but the truth could no longer be ignored. The Red Army was collapsing from within. On May 6th, Soviet troops in Prague surrendered their central command post without orders. Entire divisions refused to fire on civilians. Transport brigades deserted en masse. Prague had not just resisted, it had won. What followed was a cascade. In East Germany, rebel soldiers took over Leipzig. In Ukraine, miners in Donetsk declared a general strike. In Lithuania, border posts were stormed. The Soviet Empire was unraveling faster than NATO could react, and yet, nuclear war still loomed. On May 9th, American surveillance confirmed the activation of launch-ready RDS-2 platforms in Belarus. In London, Churchill convened with Truman and de Gaulle via secure line. The question was no longer military, it was moral. Should the West strike first and decisively end Soviet escalation before a nuke was ever launched? Or should they gamble that the Soviet leadership was too fractured, too scared, too human to push the button? The answer came not from Washington nor from Moscow. It came from within. On May 10, 1950, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and a group of senior Soviet generals staged a coup. Backed by elements of the NKVD and the Soviet Air Force, they surrounded Stalin's dacha outside Moscow. No shots were fired. Stalin was found alone, ranting about betrayal, holding an old World War I map. He was arrested by his own guards and placed under military custody. That same night, a broadcast was made from Radio Moscow. Stalin is no longer in command. The war is over. Ceasefires are in effect. The future must now be rebuilt. And just like that, the war ended. Not with a mushroom cloud, but with a whisper of rebellion, a refusal to obey, a moment of human defiance that outshone fear. In the weeks that followed, an uneasy peace emerged. The Soviet Union did not collapse. Not yet. But its hold on Eastern Europe never recovered. Czechoslovakia regained sovereignty. Poland elected a democratic government by year's end. Germany was reunified in a fragile, neutral alliance. France and Britain rebuilt. America remained, watchful, wary, but victorious. But the scars ran deep. Tens of millions displaced, cities burned. Generations marked by loss. And in the ruins of Prague, a single statue was erected. A woman, hand raised, torch in one hand, a broken chain in the other. Her plaque read, "We rose not because we were strong, but because we had to." What do you think would have happened if this alternate world became reality? Would it have made our world better or worse? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this journey fascinating, don't forget to like and share the video.